camera. Let's go. Before I get started, a few things. First, I was recently approached. They told me they would rather I put out more music than put out this thing here, this History of the Power of GAFAM. I won't be doing that. I'm a stubborn boy. And don't worry about the music. I'll be putting stuff on the other channel. I'll be releasing music just as regularly, all right, as I have previously. Secondly, some people have reached out and said that they're really enjoying it. Thank you to you. That's very nice. And I'd invite you, if you're so inclined, to, you know, the normal things, like leave a comment. The algorithm really likes that. And maybe recommend it to a friend if you're enjoying it, if you're learning something. Enjoy the show. Enjoy the show. Chapter 4, The Landlord's Game. So now that we've arrived at the World Wide Web, the technology that we broadly mean when we refer to the internet, I'd like to put that aside for a second and briefly digress to look at a different history entirely. The origins of the board game Monopoly. I think it's an interesting story. I think it contains some concepts and lessons that might be useful later on. That's why we're doing this. Monopoly is a game I imagine most of you have played. But in case you haven't, you roll dice, then you move along the sides of a square board across fields representing properties, real estate that you buy and develop and then rent out to the other players using fake money. There are some special fields that send you to jail and stuff, but the point is you own everything and bankrupt everybody else, and then you win the game. We had this game at home. We'd play that with friends. There was a time as a child I really liked it, admittedly. But as you might agree, it gets frustrating and boring, in my opinion. To my surprise, as it turns out, that was by design. The official story around the creation of this game goes that this guy, Charles Darrow, came up with the idea for the game all by himself in his basement in the 1930s. This stroke of genius saved his family from bankruptcy, and moreover, this invention saved the company, the Parker Brothers, that went on to produce, market, and distribute the game. It's very inspiring, very memeable, very American dream, but also total fabrication. You see, something funny happened in the 1970s. A guy called Ralph Ansbach conceived of a game he called anti-monopoly, which was about the measures that you can take against monopolies. This prompted a lawsuit by the Parker Brothers, this game company that owns the board game Monopoly, about the use of the term monopoly in the title. They basically said that he was profiting off of their brand and people's confusion. And this whole story is covered in detail in The Monopolists, a book by Mary Pilon, a wonderful book that this chapter relies on very heavily. Anyway, during the course of this decade-spanning court case, Ralph Ansbach discovered that the official story of the invention of the game was entirely untrue. Charles Darrow, a small-time entrepreneur, was indeed down on his luck, as so many were during the Great Depression. He lived in Atlantic City. One evening, his wife Esther's friend Charles Todd invited them over for dinner, and afterwards the Todds introduced them to their homemade version of Monopoly. Recognizing the thrill of the game and sensing an opportunity, Charles Darrow hired an illustrator and soon began mass-producing the game and selling it to a local general store. He approached the Parker brothers with an offer, and when they saw how fast this game was flying off of the shelves, they agreed to make a deal with the man. He should get a licensing fee for every copy of the game sold, and they would cover production and distribution. The Todds never heard from Charles Darrow again. Charles Todd, for one, was incensed by all this. He was a Quaker, and Quakers don't press charges. I don't know why, I haven't looked into that. But, so yeah, his Quaker beliefs kept him from pursuing legal action. But what right did Darrow have to sell as his invention the game that they had shown him? However, it wasn't the Todds who had invented the game either. In fact, to them the actual origin was not known. They had learned it from some other Quakers in town, who supposedly had picked it up from students at Williams College in New England. The game had practically been in the public domain. People made their own boards and explained the rules to one another. But where did it come from? Ralph Ansbach, uncovering this history bit by bit, had to know. And eventually, he came across the Landlord's game. Now, the Landlord's game had the same layout and mechanics as what would later be called Monopoly, but was patented in 1904 by a woman named Lizzie Maggie, or Elizabeth Maggie, or then later E.M. Phillips. The Landlord's game, her game, only had one significant difference. You only played with the by now well-known Monopoly rules of hoarding all the property by one player up until the point where everybody agrees that this is stupid and this has to stop, and then you switch to a new set of rules which include a property tax. The game was a critique. It was a satire and educational. She had been a Quaker by religion as well, and had studied and admired the theories of Henry George, an economist who kept advocating for this one tax, the land tax. And that was what she wanted to bring out. That's what she wanted to teach people about. Lizzie Maggie worked with various distributors over the years, but purchases of her game didn't really take off. What did happen, however, is that word of mouth had people teaching the game to each other on homemade boards and developed different names for it, including Monopoly. She renewed her patent on the game in 1924, but by then the game had really taken on a life of its own. Going back to the 1970s, during this long legal battle, Ralph Ansbach's discovery of the true inventor of the game had the Parker brothers really nervous, because this wasn't news to them. In fact, Lizzie Maggie had approached the Parker brothers back then, shortly after registering her first patent in 1904, but they just didn't see the appeal. Decades later, however, once they had made their deal with Charles Darrow, they understood that in order to cover their asses, they were going to have to secure the patent to the Landlord's game from a 72-year-old Lizzie Maggie. They offered her a one-time fee of $500, and Maggie, not realizing yet what was going on and just being happy that there was renewed interest in her meanwhile decades-old game, accepted. So once it was clear that Ralph Ansbach was in the midst of uncovering a very uncomfortable history for the Parker brothers, they changed their tune with regard to their lawsuit against Ralph Ansbach. Instead of following through on suing him over the name of his game, they offered him instead $500,000 as well as a management position at their company. Now, Ralph thought that this was for him to shut up about Lizzie Maggie. Ansbach's lawyers were thrilled because clearly no better outcome could possibly have been imagined. What his lawyers and the Parker brothers were both pretty horrified to discover, though, was that Ralph Ansbach was Ralph fucking Ansbach. After deliberating for an evening with his wife and children, he returned to his lawyer the next day to announce that he was not going to yield. By this point, he was not so concerned about his own game anymore. What was important to him was that the people learned about Lizzie Maggie, even if the case was going to drag on for another decade. His lawyers, you have to assume, face-palmed and dropped him. So Ralph went out and got a new one, an interesting one, Benjamin Barney Dreyfus, a champion of underdogs. And ultimately, to cut a long story short, they won the case after some 12 years. It had cost him his marriage, ultimately, and although he was now allowed to market his game anti-monopoly as such, it was not a success. However, he was allowed to talk about the history that he had uncovered. And so he wrote a book about the whole thing called The $1 Billion Swindle. And if he hadn't, Lizzie Maggie's story might never have become known. Speaking of which, Lizzie Maggie eventually did catch wind of the raw deal that she'd gotten. She saw her invention become a worldwide success, yet stripped of its anti-capitalist message, and attributed it to some guy called Charles Darrow, without her getting the slightest acknowledgement. She went to the newspapers with her story, displaying the Landlord's game next to that of Monopoly to illustrate the similarities. But, for whatever reason, and you have to imagine sexism being a part of it, as well as the fact that there was kind of a lot going on in the late 1930s, her story never went viral. She died in 1948. Neither her obituary nor her headstone mention her role in inventing Monopoly. So while there's no direct connection between this story and the history that I'm trying to discuss here, there are, as I mentioned at the beginning of this digression, some things we can learn from this story that are relevant to the main topic at hand. Perhaps more than anything, I'm trying to remind you of what it felt like to play Monopoly and prime you to the mechanics of running and maintaining a Monopoly, because monopolies play a huge part in the history of computing and the internet. Secondly, this story is a reminder that monopolies, as well as strategies to avoid such things, have a long tradition. And as evidenced by, the world that we find ourselves in presently, this tension hasn't exactly been resolved. And thirdly, this story is a perfect example of how eagerly women specifically have been written out of our histories. This is an important aspect to keep in mind when dealing with the history of the power of GAFAM, because it sure does seem like it's a story heavily dominated by men. That appearance, as we're going to see, is also deceptive. Let me strongly recommend the book that this chapter relies on, even if it's not about technology. It's just a great read, The Monopolists by Mary Pilon. Before we continue next week with part 2, which, as I've already alluded to, is not going to be particularly pleasant, I'd like to end with another little anecdote about Lizzie Maggie. In 1907, she was living in Chicago and working as a stenographer for $10 a week. Frustrated with this, she put out an ad in a local paper, satirically offering herself up as a young woman American slave. The ad read, "Intelligent, educated, refined, true, honest, poetical, philosophical, broad-minded, and big-souled, and womanly above all things. Brunette, large grey-green eyes, full passionate lips, splendid teeth, not beautiful but very attractive, features full of character and strength, yet truly feminine. Height, 5 feet 3 inches, well-proportioned, graceful. The ad drew attention all over the country, and when asked by reporters about it, Lizzie told them that the goal was to make a statement about the dismal position of women in American society at the time. She went on to say that, "In a short time, I hope a very short time, men and women will discover that they are poor because Carnegie and Rockefeller have more than they know what to do with. My people believe that the only way to help working girls is to get rich and give something to the poor. And that is just the way not to do it. Working girls want only what they produce. If they get that, they will have all they need."